Please open the door. My mommy is in there." 5-year-old Zoe Carter pounded both fists against the steel walk-in freezer while tears streamed down her small brown face. Her red knitted scarf had slipped from one shoulder, and one of her shoes was missing, lost somewhere in the mansion kitchen as she ran for help. Inside the freezer, her mother, Imani, struck the door with the flat of her hand. "Zoe, stay where I can hear you." Her voice sounded weaker than it had moments earlier. Cold air burned Imani's lungs. Frost clung to the metal shelves around her, covering trays of expensive seafood and imported desserts prepared for the Lancaster Foundation dinner upstairs. She wore only her black maid's uniform, white apron, and thin stockings. No coat. No gloves. Outside, Zoe pulled desperately at the handle. It would not move. Someone had locked it from the corridor. That someone was Sloane Mercer, the elegant blonde woman who would marry billionaire Reid Lancaster in 6 weeks. Sloane stood several feet away, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist as though a terrified child were not crying in front of her. "Stop making noise," she said. "Your mother is being disciplined." Zoe turned toward her. "She'll get sick." She should have thought about that before touching things that don't belong to her. Imani pressed her ear against the frozen door. "Miss Mercer, please let me out. My daughter has asthma. She's frightened." Sloane stepped closer, lowering her voice so the kitchen staff in the distant banquet hall could not hear. "You should be more concerned about your job." Then she took the freezer key from her palm, slipped it into her silver clutch, and walked away. Zoe screamed after her. Upstairs, 200 guests applauded as Reid Lancaster entered the ballroom. He had returned from Chicago almost 4 hours earlier than expected. Sloane did not know that yet. And within minutes, the sound of one little girl crying would lead him toward a locked steel door, and toward the truth about the woman he planned to marry. 3 days earlier, Imani Carter had arrived at the Lancaster estate before 6 in the morning. The mansion stood beyond iron gates on 20 acres outside Greenwich, Connecticut. Its limestone walls, high windows, and carefully shaped gardens made it look less like a home and more like a place designed to remind visitors who held power. Imani had worked there for 14 months. At 30 years old, she had already learned that wealth did not always make people cruel. It simply gave cruel people more room to hide what they were. She entered through the staff door with Zoe beside her. The little girl wore the red scarf Imani had knitted during the previous winter. One end was slightly longer than the other, and the stitches around the edge were uneven, but Zoe treated it like something precious. "Grandma taught you to make this," she said proudly. "She did. Then Grandma helped make it too." Imani smiled despite the exhaustion behind her eyes. Her mother had died 18 months earlier after a long illness. The medical bills had taken nearly everything Imani had saved. The Lancaster job paid well enough to cover rent, food, and Zoe's inhalers, but only if Imani accepted every extra shift Sloane gave her. That morning, the head housekeeper was ill, and the regular babysitter had cancelled. Reid had previously told Imani she could bring Zoe whenever necessary. Sloane had never forgiven him for that kindness. Imani settled Zoe at a small table near the kitchen pantry with crayons and a picture book. "Stay here until breakfast service is finished." Zoe nodded seriously. "I'll be invisible." Imani's smile disappeared. "Who told you to say that?" Zoe looked down at her drawing. "Miss Sloane said good maids and their children are invisible." Before Imani could respond, heels clicked across the kitchen floor. Sloane entered wearing a cream suit, her pale hair pinned neatly behind her head. She looked prepared for a magazine photograph, even at 6:15 in the morning. Her gaze moved from Imani to Zoe. "I thought I made myself clear about bringing her here. Mr. Lancaster gave me permission." Sloane's lips curved into a cold smile. "Reid gives permission because he doesn't understand how a household should be managed." She'll stay in the kitchen and won't disturb anyone. She already is. Zoe gripped the red scarf in both hands. Imani stepped slightly in front of her daughter. What would you like me to begin with? Sloane placed a folder on the marble island. The foundation dinner has been moved to Friday. Reid's largest investors will attend, along with the hospital board and several reporters. Imani opened the folder. The staffing schedule had her name written beside nearly every difficult task. Polishing the ballroom floors. Preparing guest rooms. Assisting the catering team. Cleaning after midnight. This is more than 30 additional hours, she said carefully. You said you needed money. I do, but I also need time to arrange childcare. Sloane leaned closer. Then decide which matters more, your daughter's schedule or your daughter's home. Imani understood the threat immediately. Sloane knew her lease was overdue. She knew one missed paycheck could leave Imani and Zoe without an apartment. Before Imani could answer, a man's voice came from the kitchen entrance. Why would she have to choose? Reid Lancaster stood in the doorway. At 39, he carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to rooms changing the moment he entered them. His dark suit was simple, but everything about him, from the silver watch at his wrist to his measured expression, made it clear that he was the owner of the estate. Sloane turned, her coldness disappearing instantly. Reid. I didn't hear you. I noticed. His eyes moved to the schedule in Imani's hand. Then to Zoe, clutching her red scarf. What's going on? He asked. Sloane smiled. But for the first time, Imani saw fear hiding beneath it. Sloane recovered quickly. She crossed the kitchen and slipped one arm through Reid's as though he had interrupted nothing more serious than a discussion about table linens. Imani misunderstood, she said lightly. I was offering her extra hours because she mentioned needing money. I would never pressure her. Reid looked at Imani. Is that what happened? Imani felt Sloane's gaze settle on her like a warning. One honest sentence could cost her the job. One lie would protect the woman humiliating her. I asked for additional work, Imani said carefully. I just need time to arrange care for Zoe. Reid studied her face. He had known Imani long enough to recognize the difference between calm and fear, but before he could question her further, Zoe climbed down from her chair and approached him. Mr. Reid. He crouched so they were eye level. What is it, little star? Zoe held out her drawing. It showed the mansion beneath a giant yellow sun. Reid stood near the front door. Imani was beside the kitchen window. Zoe had drawn herself between them wearing her red scarf. Sloane stood alone at the edge of the page. Her face had been covered with thick black crayon. Reid looked at the drawing, then at Zoe. Why is Miss Sloane over there? The little girl glanced nervously toward Sloane. She likes being where Mommy can't see her. Imani's breath caught. Sloane laughed too loudly. Children say the strangest things. She took the page from Reid's hand. Zoe, why don't you finish this somewhere else? The paper tore slightly between her fingers. Zoe pulled back, frightened. Reid stood. Give it to her. Sloane's smile tightened. I was only helping. You were tearing it. He removed the picture gently and returned it to Zoe. Keep this safe. Zoe nodded and hurried back to the table. Sloane watched her with a look Imani had seen before, cold, calculating, and patient. Reid turned to Imani. Arrange whatever childcare you need. You will not work 30 extra hours unless you choose to. Thank you, sir. And if anything in this house makes you uncomfortable, you come directly to me. Sloane's fingers tightened around his sleeve. She works for the household, Reid. She doesn't need private access to you every time she dislikes an assignment. Reid looked at her. I decide who has access to me. The silence that followed was brief but sharp. Then Reid checked his phone. I have to leave for the hospital board meeting. I'll be back late. Sloane softened her voice immediately. Of course. I'll handle everything here. Reid kissed her cheek, but his attention remained on Imani. Call if there's a problem. After he left, Sloane waited until the front door closed. Then she walked toward the staff table and placed both hands on the edge. You embarrassed me. Imani kept her voice low. I didn't say anything. You let your child say it for you. She's 5. She is old enough to understand consequences. Imani stepped forward. Do not threaten my daughter. For the first time, the controlled maid's voice carried open steel. Sloane's eyes narrowed. That courage is new. No. You just mistook silence for weakness. The words hung between them. Sloane glanced toward the hallway to make sure no one had heard. Then she leaned close. Friday's dinner matters more than you understand. Reid will announce the final hospital partnership. My family's foundation is part of that agreement. Nothing will interfere with it. Not your complaints. Not your child. Not anything you think you've noticed. Imani frowned. What would I have noticed? Sloane's expression changed for half a second. It was enough. Stay out of rooms where you don't belong, she said. Then she turned and left. That afternoon, Imani carried fresh linens to the second-floor guest suite. As she passed Reid's private study, she heard Sloane speaking behind the partly open door. My father needs the transfer before Friday, Sloane said into her phone. Once Reid signs the hospital agreement, the money will move through the foundation account. Imani stopped. A man's voice answered faintly through the speaker. And the internal audit? I'll deal with it. Reid trusts me. What about the maid? Sloane lowered her voice. She saw the donor files last week. Imani's stomach tightened. She had not read anything deliberately. A folder had fallen from Reid's desk while she cleaned. Several payment records had scattered across the floor. One name had appeared repeatedly, Mercer Family Foundation. The same amount had been transferred 3 times. Imani had placed everything back without asking questions. Sloane continued. She already has enough problems. One accusation, and no one will believe her over us. Imani backed away before the floorboard beneath her shoe could creak. That evening, she waited until Zoe was asleep in their small apartment before calling the number Reid had given her. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Before she could press it, a message appeared from an unknown number. A photograph showed Zoe entering the Lancaster estate that morning. Beneath it were 6 words. Keep quiet if you want her safe. Imani's blood turned cold. The next morning, she returned to work because she could not risk disappearing and making Sloane suspicious. In the kitchen, Zoe sat quietly with her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Sloane entered carrying a ring of household keys. One large silver key was marked freezer. She looked directly at Imani and smiled. Friday night, she said, you and I are going to settle this. Friday arrived under a sky the color of steel. By late afternoon, the Lancaster estate had transformed into a world of white flowers, crystal glass, and rehearsed smiles. Reporters waited near the entrance while hospital trustees and investors discussed the partnership Reid would announce before dessert. Imani worked without stopping. She carried trays and kept Zoe close. The threat from the unknown number remained in her pocket, printed in her mind more clearly than any photograph. Keep quiet if you want her safe. Each time Sloane entered, Imani checked for the silver freezer key on her ring. Reid had left for a meeting and was not expected back until 9. Sloane had told everyone his flight from Chicago had been delayed, but Imani knew he had not gone to Chicago at all. He was meeting the hospital board across town. That lie troubled her. At 6:30, the head caterer asked Imani to collect a tray of specialty desserts from the walk-in freezer. Sloane was standing beside him. "I'll come with you," she said. Imani's stomach tightened. "I can manage." "I'm sure you can." Zoe sat at the corner table with her coloring book and red scarf. Imani crouched beside her. "Stay here with Mrs. Bell. Don't follow me." Zoe nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on Sloane. The service corridor was nearly empty. Music from the ballroom sounded distant behind the walls. When Imani opened the freezer, cold air rolled across her face. Metal shelves held pastries, seafood, and sculpted ice. "The desserts are in the back," Sloane said. Imani stepped inside. She found the correct tray and turned. Sloane stood in the doorway, no longer smiling. "You should have listened to the message." Imani gripped the tray. "You sent it. You were becoming difficult. You threatened my child. I warned you." Imani set the tray down carefully. "Reid will learn about the foundation transfers." Sloane's expression sharpened. "Reid will learn that an unstable employee tried to blackmail his fiancée after being caught stealing donor records. No one will believe that. They will when the files are found in your locker." Imani's heart dropped. Sloane stepped backward and pulled the heavy door. Imani lunged forward, but the steel slammed shut before she reached it. The lock clicked from outside. "Sloane." No answer came. Imani struck the door. "Open it." The refrigeration fans roared overhead. Cold air pushed through the thin fabric of her uniform. Outside, Sloane walked back toward the kitchen and slipped the silver key into her clutch. She had expected Zoe to remain at the table. But the chair was empty. Zoe had followed them into the corridor and hidden behind a linen cart. She had seen the door close. She had seen Sloane lock it. "Let my mommy out," she whispered. Sloane turned sharply. Then Sloane crouched in front of her. "Your mother went home." Zoe shook her head. "She's in there. You're confused." "I heard her." Sloane reached for the child's arm. Zoe pulled away and ran. She raced through the kitchen into the crowded ballroom, calling for help. But music and conversation swallowed her small voice. Behind her, Sloane followed at a controlled pace, smiling at guests as though nothing was wrong. Zoe reached the main staircase and nearly collided with a tall man in a dark overcoat. Reid had returned early. He caught her before she fell. Her face was wet with tears. "Zoe." She grabbed his sleeve with both hands. "Mr. Reid, please come." Miss Sloane locked Mommy in the cold room. Across the ballroom, Sloane stopped walking. For the first time that night, her perfect smile disappeared. Reid's expression changed the instant he heard Zoe's words. He lifted the little girl into his arms. "Show me." Zoe pointed toward the service corridor. Sloane moved quickly across the ballroom, forcing a laugh as nearby guests turned to watch. "Reid, she's frightened and confused." Imani probably stepped outside. Zoe clung tighter to his neck. "No." Mommy said, "Stay where I can hear you." "She's in the cold room." Reid looked at Sloane. "Where is the freezer key?" Her smile remained in place, but her hand moved instinctively toward her silver clutch. "The kitchen manager has it." Reid noticed the movement. He held out his hand. "Give me the bag." Sloane's face tightened. "You're embarrassing me in front of everyone. A child says her mother has been locked inside a freezer. Your embarrassment is not my concern." The nearest conversations stopped. Sloane glanced toward the reporters at the ballroom entrance. Then she lowered her voice. "Think carefully. The hospital announcement begins in 10 minutes. Reid handed Zoe to an elderly staff member. "Stay with Mrs. Bell." Then he took Sloane's clutch from her hand before she could stop him. The silver key lay inside. Reid ran. Zoe followed despite Mrs. Bell calling after her. Several staff members and 2 hospital trustees hurried behind them. At the end of the service corridor, Reid heard it. A faint strike against metal. Then another. Imani. Inside the freezer, Imani forced herself upright. Her fingers had become numb. Her breathing was shallow, and frost clung to the ends of her hair. Reid. He unlocked the door and pulled it open. Imani stumbled forward. Reid caught her before she hit the floor and wrapped his coat around her shaking shoulders. Zoe threw herself against her mother. "Mommy." "I'm here," Imani whispered, though her lips had begun turning blue. "I'm all right." "You are not all right," Reid said. He lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the kitchen. Sloane stood at the end of the corridor, surrounded by guests who had followed the commotion. "She went inside herself," Sloane said quickly. "She must have allowed the door to close." Reid stopped. "Then why was the key in your bag?" Sloane hesitated. "I found it after she disappeared." Zoe shook her head fiercely. "She locked Mommy." "I saw." Sloane's voice sharpened. "She's a child, Reid. Children invent things." Imani looked up from his arms. "She threatened Zoe." The hallway fell silent. Reid lowered Imani carefully onto a kitchen chair as the estate physician rushed forward with blankets. "What threat?" Reid asked. Imani removed her phone with trembling fingers and showed him the message containing Zoe's photograph. Sloane stared at the screen. "That proves nothing." "It proves someone followed a 5-year-old girl," Reid said. Imani reached inside her apron and removed a folded sheet of paper. Before entering the freezer, she had copied the suspicious foundation transfers from the donor file. "The same payment was sent 3 times, she explained. "All 3 went to a company owned by Sloane's father." Reid examined the figures. His face became unreadable. Sloane stepped toward him. "She stole private documents. This is exactly what I warned you about." Reid looked at Imani. "Did you take the original files?" "No. Only this copy." "Where are the originals?" "In your study." Sloane interrupted. "They aren't there anymore." The words left her mouth before she could stop them. Everyone heard. Reid turned slowly. "How do you know?" Sloane's lips parted, but no answer came. From the ballroom, the master of ceremonies announced that the hospital partnership presentation would begin in 5 minutes. Reid handed the copied transfer record to one of the trustees. "Call your internal auditor. Tell him to freeze every payment connected to the Mercer Foundation." Sloane's composure finally cracked. "You cannot destroy my family over the word of a maid." Reid's voice remained calm. "No. You may have destroyed your family when you locked her behind that door." He looked toward the ballroom filled with investors, trustees, and cameras. "Do not leave," he told Sloane. "You wanted tonight to secure your future." His eyes hardened. "Now everyone is going to learn exactly how you planned to buy it." 10 minutes later, Reid stood before the ballroom's investors, hospital trustees, and reporters. Sloane remained beside him, pale but defiant. "This announcement has changed," Reid said. "Tonight, I discovered that funds intended for children's medical care were transferred through the Mercer Foundation into a private company controlled by Sloane's father. A hospital trustee confirmed that the repeated payments had already been frozen." Sloane stepped toward the microphone. "He is believing a maid who stole confidential documents." "No," Reid replied. "I am believing the transfer records, your own words, and the freezer key found inside your bag." Zoe stood near the doorway, wrapped around her mother's hand. Reid looked directly at Sloane. "You also threatened a child and locked her mother in a freezer because she discovered your fraud." Gasps moved through the room. Sloane reached for his arm. "Reid, please. Think about our wedding. He removed her engagement ring and placed it on the table. I am. Security escorted Sloane away while investigators collected the donor files from her car. Her father was later charged with fraud, and the Mercer Foundation was permanently removed from the hospital partnership. Imani recovered fully. Reid offered her money, but she refused charity. Instead, she accepted a new position overseeing staff welfare and foundation accountability, with independent authority to report misconduct. 6 months later, Zoe sat in Reid's office drawing another picture of the mansion. This time, nobody stood alone at the edge of the page. Imani's redrafted staff policy lay beside her, protecting every employee from retaliation, unsafe conditions, and unpaid overtime. Reid looked at the child's drawing. "Where is Miss Sloane?" Zoe picked up her black crayon, then placed it back in the box. "She doesn't live in our picture anymore." Imani smiled. For the first time in a long while, neither did fear.